Okay, hello, this is Markus Binch from Coaches Across Continents. I'm welcoming you to the Child Rights in Sport webinar from our virtual learning community from this month. I'm happy to conduct and be leading this webinar for the first time. Some people may know me from the online education program that I'm conducting with participants all around the world, and today I'm happy to present to you the topic about child rights and child protection. As I mentioned, the Child Rights webinar is part of our virtual learning community, and today we will be discussing the importance of child protection, and we will share best practices on how to protect children from violations against their rights. As always during our webinars, please feel free to ask any questions by using the chat box on the bottom right. I have also some leading questions during the webinar that we will discuss. I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't, please send a quick note also through the chat box on the bottom right. And otherwise, if you want me to stop in between or explain something further, please raise your hand or also send a quick message on the bottom right. There is a hand signal on the bottom that you can press, so I can see where I need to stop. Those of you who have already participated in the on-field training with Coaches Across Continents, they know that we put a lot of emphasis on child protection. And at the beginning, I would like to explain a bit why that is. We are implementing our child protection trainings since January 2014 at all our programs that we run around the world. So that means we're working in 30 countries and do that at all our programs. But prior to that, child protection talks we started to run at our programs. We developed in partnership with UNICEF and other organizations the International Safeguards for Children in Sport. And this was a more than 2 years long process between 2012 and 2014. And the child rights policy and the child protection policy that we have developed is one of the results from that 2-year-long process. And because we implement our child protection policy at all our programs in 30 countries around the world, we can share best practices and ideas from groups around the world, and we are happy to create with today's webinar platform where also you can directly share your expertise and experience. I'm happy to see that we have about 20 participants from all around the world on this webinar, and this will definitely impact and enhance the discussions and the opportunity to share ideas. First, I would like to give you an overview of what this webinar will be about. First, we will have an introduction with 2 leading questions about child rights and child protection. Then we will come to the forms of child abuse, and after that we will discuss what steps we need to take and can take and what we need to consider when we develop a child rights policy or child protection policy. The second last point will be child protection on and off the field and what we as coaches can do to protect children from violations against their rights. And the last point is about a child protection campaign that I came across recently during the preparation of this webinar. It's called Polished Man, and I will talk a bit more about that at the end. Okay, first, I would like to ask you the question, what do you associate with the words child rights. When you hear child rights, what do you think of? What do you think about? And I would like to ask you to type your answers in the box on the bottom right. So your input is important now. Education, yeah, thank you, Alex. Human rights, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will go through the points and probably make some comments as they're coming in. Yeah, to the education part, we will talk more about that when we speak about what we as coaches can do. I like the comment from Charlie about child rights are human rights. And I also like how some of you make examples of different child rights. It's interesting. What are the first child rights that are coming to our mind? The right to learn, the right to be free, to grow as people. Also, as Daniel says, looking after the best interest of each child. Yeah, healthcare, freedom. Yeah, I read very often freedom a couple of times. Respect, listening to children. Very good. Yeah, I like all this feedback. Education and safety. Yeah, we will come to the safety part and well-being part later on. Yeah, and I like also what Alex says, to be who they are with confidence. And I think that goes together with what Nora says, listening to children. Very good. Thank you very much. Now, the second question. What do you associate with the words child abuse? Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you for the first comments. They're coming in. Daniel, Paula, Alex, Peggy. Yeah, it's interesting. They are going exactly into the opposite direction what you have been mentioning before. Yeah, exploitation and fear, being neglected, violence and power. That goes exactly against human development, freedom, being listened to. Yeah, these two terms, child rights and child abuse, are contradictory. Yeah, I see also Judith, Dr. Judith Gates, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, naming and categorizing different types of abuse that we will talk in more detail just in a second. Yeah. And then also, I like Sarah's comments, then thinking also about the consequences that these abuses, child abuses have. Yeah, suffering, fear, feeling neglected. So there's different stages and different aspects to it. There's the abuse itself, but there's also then the consequences for the well-being of the child, consequences in their experience. I read also a lot of neglecting, as has been mentioned a lot. Being neglected is one of the examples for child abuse. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Hard labor, yeah, thank you, Samuel. That's an important aspect as well, and a form of child abuse that happens in many, many different parts of the world. Good. These comments that you made lead us right to our next slide, which basically categorizes a bit things that you have been mentioning, and gives us an overview of the different forms of child abuse. And we have here I've listed here four major categories with some examples. So I would like to go through them step by step. The first that I've mentioned here is verbal abuse, that usually shows in the way we speak to a person, to a child, by shouting or calling names or swearing, embarrassing somebody with the language that we're using. That's an abuse that happens very commonly, and that also we will see it a bit later, overlaps with the other types of abuses very often. The second type of abuse is physical abuse, which shows in the form of hitting a child, or what has been mentioned, child labor, for example, pushing, grabbing, are examples for physical abuse. When we get to the third category, sexual abuse, that has been mentioned also by Judith Gates, and that can materialize in the way of inappropriate touching or using sexual language, seductive looks, and in worst case, we know that rape is a form of sexual abuse. But I've listed all the other examples before that because very often when we talk about sexual abuse, rape comes to our mind very quickly. But we also need to be aware as coaches, as teachers, as facilitators, that sexual abuse starts much earlier, or can start much earlier than rape. And the last category that I've listed here is emotional abuse, sometimes also referred as psychological abuse or mental abuse, which many of you have given us examples for, like this neglecting children. Bullying is a problem that appears in many communities around the world. It's also a huge problem in schools, in sports clubs, in teams. Bullying is something I think many of us have probably also experienced themselves. Being ignored, that's I think also one of the worst abuses and experiences you can make. Not being seen, being ignored, being left aside, being degraded, being terrorized. All those behaviors are forms of emotional abuse. And this list that I've made is obviously categorizing those forms of abuse, partly in a bit artificial way, because very often these different forms of child abuse are overlapping. So if I made this example with verbal abuse, is also always emotional abuse, because if somebody shouts at me, that will obviously also affect me emotionally, it will affect me mentally. Or if I, for example, get sexually abused, that can also harm me physically. It can have physical impact, negative physical impact on my body. So sexual abuse can be also at the same time physical abuse. So these different forms of abuses can overlap, but I think it's very important to be aware of those different forms. Before we move on to the next slide, which would go towards what we can do and what we need to consider when it comes to developing a child protection or child rights policy, I would like to ask you a poll question. Okay. The question is, does your organization have a child protection policy? You can simply click yes or no, which will give me a better idea of what the situation is within your organization, within the setting that you work. I'll give a few more seconds to respond to that question. We have about a 50% turnout so far, so please make a choice. Does your organization have a child protection policy? Yes or no? Okay. Thank you very much for participating. Votes are coming in, so I'll give a few more seconds. We're getting close to 100%. So please leave your vote. Okay. Thank you very much. So the result is we had 19 people responding to this question. About 60, a bit more than 63% of you work in an organization that has a child protection policy. About 37% of you don't have a child protection policy yet. So 2/3 of you already work with an existing child protection policy. Okay, because this went so well, I will have a second question for you. This asks you now a bit more about your personal opinion. Do you think a child protection policy can help to prevent child abuse? You can answer, you have 3 different options to answer. Yes, no, or you are unsure. Do you think a child protection policy can help to prevent child abuse? Yeah, I see some people also respond on the bottom right in the box. That's okay, but please also click onto the options you have in the poll question, because then it goes into the statistics. So I have 2 votes so far. I see there's a lot of yes on the right side. There's a couple of no's, but please click onto the options in the poll. Do you think a child protection policy can help to prevent child abuse? Okay, good. So I'll have a brief look here on the right hand side. There's been many yeses, many yes answers. 2 or 3 people saying no. Okay, I'll present the results. Unfortunately, there were only 2 votes in that poll. So thank you very much for responding. Many of you said the child protection policy can help to prevent child abuse. Okay. Thank you very much for participating. Yeah, thank you very much for this comment, Nora. I was just about to say that. A child protection policy, can it help or does it not help? And Nora said unsure, because it also needs the training. Yeah, and it also needs the implementation. We see that also a lot with women's rights policies, but I think the same applies with child rights policies. They do exist, but very often there's also a challenge with that they are not being implemented. They are sitting somewhere in a drawer, and they are written down, but people don't know about them. People don't know how to apply them. People don't know which steps to take when they get to know about child abuse. All these different things that we will discuss on the next slides. That's an important aspect. I personally think, yes, child protection policies can help to prevent child abuse, but only if they are implemented and if people are trained in a way to know how they need to be used and how they need to be applied. But I will also go quickly back to that first poll question where about 2/3 of you said that they have an existing child protection policy in their organization, and 1/3 of you said they don't have an existing child protection policy. I think that's a good mix, because in the next slides we will talk about the steps to take in creating a child protection policy. And those of you who have already a child protection policy will be able to give some valuable input for the points that we're going to discuss now. Okay, so I've put together really just a few points that came to my mind when thinking about what are some of the important aspects when developing a child rights policy or child protection policy. What are some of the important aspects we should consider? And this is definitely not a complete list, and I'm very happy to receive your input and widen my understanding. So first I have written down that one important aspect is definitely to name the different children's rights that are most important for you as an organization that you want to focus on. And during the next couple of minutes, I will also refer a bit to our CAC's, Coaches Across Continents, child protection policy. So this can be, for example, the children's right, the right to play, or the right to be treated with kindness, which is, for example, one of the points that we have added to our child protection policy. The different children's rights that you think are most valuable, most important for that context that you work in. The second important aspect that came to my mind, and that is also part of our child protection policy, is that you need to name the non-negotiables, the so-called do's and don'ts of the coach. By giving a few examples of our child protection policy, is that we say, for example, the coach needs to make sure that the child is safe, physically safe, and also emotionally safe while it is with you. So that would be one of the do's, that the coach must ensure the physical and emotional safety of the child. And one of the don'ts that we have in our child protection policy is that a child should never be hit or physically abused by a coach. And this could be now again points that you need to think about when you develop your child protection policy, or if you want to update it. I think that's also an important aspect of developing a child protection policy that can be an ongoing process. You might develop a child protection policy, and after 2 or 3 years you might review it, and you might update it, and you might change things, add things, or delete things. Another point that came to my mind when thinking about important aspects was to name and describe the different forms of abuse. We have spoken about that earlier, where you have named the different things that come to your mind when you think about child abuse. So this would be an important question to ask yourself when developing a child protection policy. For example, it can be physical abuse, and it can be then also defined more specifically, as we did before, that physical abuse means hitting or child labor. Yeah, and another important step to take is, and another important aspect to consider is to write down and elaborate the steps that somebody needs to take when witnessing or getting informed about child abuse. I think that's also when it comes to that training aspect that Nora mentioned earlier, or the implementation that I mentioned earlier, that it is not just a policy that sits somewhere in a drawer and is not getting used. It's important that your employees, your volunteers, the people that work for your organization know which steps they need to take. These were the points that came to my mind. Now I would like to ask you, can you think of any other important aspects when developing a child rights policy? Other than the four that I've just mentioned. Or possibly also elaborating those aspects in a different way. Can you think of any other important aspects when developing a child rights policy? Yeah, thank you, Judith, for sharing that. Yeah, I think involving all relevant people in the community. That also goes back to that success story and success part in terms of the implementation. And the last aspect that I mentioned, to think about the different steps to take if you get to know about child abuse. It's also important that people have been involved in the development, people who work for your organization, but also people in your community, so you can make sure that this child protection policy is widely respected and people are willing to follow it. Yeah, Brian said getting feedback from various stakeholders. The stakeholders can be relevant people in the community. Establishing a monitoring plan to track incidents in the community. Yeah, that's very important, Frederick. Thank you for saying that. That's the aspect about what steps need to be taken. Yeah, who is monitoring? Who is the person that I can turn to if I'm witnessing as a coach that there is child abuse going on, and that child abuse, somebody is suffering from child abuse, who is on my team, who is in my group? Where do I go to? Who is the person I can turn to? Thank you also for Nora's comment, who said to localize it, yeah, to make it locally relevant, and to consider also local circumstances. Where are the challenges? Yeah, we will get to that question in a second. To think about the challenges. Yeah, thank you, Alex, raising awareness about the issues. Probably you can elaborate a bit what issues you mean. Are you meaning the issues about child abuse, or the issues about creating a child protection policy? Yeah, I hear very often and read very often the conditions to make sure that the policy is respected. It goes in the same direction what Judith said, yeah, to include everyone, to make sure that the community and all relevant people are involved. Yeah, getting feedback from the community, very good. Yeah, that's very valuable feedback on the one hand that you get from them, but it's also a kind of step to prove yourself. Are you on the right way? Are you on the right track? Will the policy that you are working on, will that be respected? Will that be followed? Yeah, parents are an important important aspect and important people to ask for their opinion. Yeah, thank you, Sunil, for that comment. The feedback from the parents and counselors. Very good. Yeah, and then obviously the training. Yeah, Daniel mentioned the explicit training to plan to ensure that the relevant stay informed and equipped. Yeah, the relevant staff stays informed and equipped. Yeah, that would be then the step that needs to be taken after the policy has been developed. Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you for these comments. Now we are getting to the challenges. It goes into that direction what Nora mentioned earlier. What are potential challenges when developing a child rights policy? You mentioned now the things you need to do, yeah, to turn to the important people. I have mentioned 4 points earlier that are crucial when developing a child protection policy. But what can be now potential challenges when approaching these steps, when approaching these topics? I would like to hear your input. Taken for granted cultural norms, Judith said. So that can be a challenge for the institution that wants to implement the policy, so they are not aware of certain abuses because they think that's normal. Is that what you are saying, Judith? They're not questioning cultural norms and therefore missing? Yeah, okay. Organized children stuff. Traditional and cultural norms, Samuel, I think goes into the same direction. Religion and tradition, mentioned by Nora, can be challenges. Okay. Resources to mobilize the community in participating. Yeah, that can be, I can really imagine as that as a big challenge. Yeah, to mobilize, you need to probably, especially in traditional circumstances, I'm thinking now of rural places in different African countries, in Kenya or in Tanzania, or rural places in Cambodia. I think it can sometimes be very challenging to mobilize everybody that needs to be involved, that has a say. Traditional and cultural stereotypes. Okay. Yeah, Elvis, thank you for that comment. Most of the time, the policies we have in our organizations are not respected. They are in opposition to cultures, religion, or beliefs. Yeah, that's a massive issue. So, following up on these, or just taking it from here now, what do you think? Is there anything we can do? Like it sounds to me very big, very like, I mean, tradition, cultures, religion. That's big words. Is there anything you can do, your organization, or what you're probably already doing? You realize this challenge to have a policy, but struggling with culture, religion, certain beliefs. Like, is there anything we can do about that? What could be ways to change that, to challenge that, or to address it? I mean, I think that's probably the first step. What is a way to address it? Raise awareness. Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect, but it also needs a lot of stamina, a lot of strength, a lot of dedication. It's a long process. And probably you could see that these webinars is probably a part of this process to also strengthen your and encourage you in your process to not give up, that you hopefully have the feeling that you are with others, although you might face these challenges in your community and you think, oh, it's pointless, they don't understand. I hope it can also help to realize that other people in other parts of the world face similar challenges. Yeah, to feel like running against the wall where it's written tradition, culture, religion. Refuse to compromise on your policy, demonstrate through the way you treat children daily. Yeah, I think that's an important aspect as well. Like, yeah, you can find already changes in the way you behave. Yeah, be the way you relate to children. Although there might be other people in your community that might not respect your policy, that might not respect your views, your values, but you can already change something by relate to your children that you work on a daily basis in a different way. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for sharing this idea. I think that's a very, very crucial point with the local leaders at the grassroots, being an example to the community through our relationships with children. Yeah, very good. Yeah. One other question that I had in mind was, yeah, well, what do you do if certain policies or a policy and certain values that you stand for are clashing with the law? Like, we know that in certain countries, for example, in Zanzibar, which is part of Tanzania, caning children, hitting children is illegal, which is then you also face a challenge there. Yeah, that can be a challenge. You have a policy, but with your policy, you are basically opposing the local law that exists. So that might be a challenge as well. Right? You might face the challenge of the difficulty of getting people on board. Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think it all comes back to our initiative to take and what Judith said earlier, to educate people, but that's a very long process to raise awareness. That's a challenge, and I think that's one of the main focuses we also have in our work. Coaches Across Continents, obviously, with our work and the different communities we are working with. I'm discussing and my colleagues are discussing on a regular basis with communities around the world if hitting children is okay, and if there's a situation where it's acceptable. And when we are facing these statements and these comments, what I usually ask is like, what is the purpose of hitting the child? What is there another solution that can get you to the same idea, to the same goal, instead of hitting? What are the negative consequences of hitting a child? That's a process that we are in with Coaches Across Continents, to raise the awareness of and questioning certain traditions, certain behaviors, with the people we're working with. Yeah, lobbying for an alternative thing, for an alternative behavior. I think that's where we are all together on the same path, Coaches Across Continents, but you also as our implementing partners locally in your countries and in your communities. Okay, good. Thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. I think we could go on for another 20 minutes, 30 minutes easily, but I want to give you the opportunity and encourage you, if you want to have help when developing your own child protection policy or reviewing your child protection policy, please contact Coaches Across Continents. Then we can go deeper into that discussion. Feel free to send me an email on marcus@coachesacrosscontinents.org, and we are very happy to assist you in this process. Sensitization on child rights in the schools. It seems like with your comments you're always already addressing the topics that I want to get to next. So let me move on to the next slide and mention it once again that feel free to contact Coaches Across Continents if you want assistance while developing your child protection policy. Now I have, I think, 3 more questions when it comes to implementing child protection on and off the field. And first I would like to ask you, what can you as a coach do to protect children from violations against their rights? Please feel free to type again on the bottom right. What do you do as a coach, as a facilitator, to protect children? Thank you. Yeah, Daniel, educate them on their rights. That's a very important aspect. Somebody, Alan, you already mentioned before I even asked the question, sensitization on child rights in the schools. Yeah, I think that's something you can do as a facilitator, as a coach. Educate children on what those rights are. Okay. Okay, educating the children about their duty to educate other adults. Yeah, we have spoken about earlier when we developed the policy who we need to involve, and I think when it comes to education, thank you, Nora, it's not only about the children, because if we educate the child but then it comes home or it goes to school and it meets other circumstances and other conditions and people who don't know about their rights, about children's rights, they don't know any other behavior, they are kept in tradition and in cultural norms, and that's a very important aspect. Yeah. Albers mentions an important aspect also, to be an example, yeah, to show the example myself. Yeah. And there's a lot again about education, educating the children, educating the parents, educating the community. Train them to make sure, I just read, that they can report cases of child abuse. Yeah, that's an important aspect where you can build a relationship with the child to be trustful, you know, to be open enough to come and share negative experiences, share abuse that they have experienced with you. Yeah, and then also obviously, as Judith says, discuss what can be done if they are abused. Yeah, thank you. Samuel, yeah, very valid point, to create a safe environment for them. That's great. That's an important aspect of putting child protection into practice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Omer mentions a part where it's also abuse happens between children. Yeah, children abusing each other. There's an important field for us as coaches to educate them as well, to make sure that they mustn't violate their friends' rights. And that comes probably also back to the duty that Sunil mentioned earlier. My freedom ends where the other person's freedom starts. Yeah. So if I want to be respected with my rights, it's my duty to respect other people's rights as well, other children's rights. I have now mentioned and listed a few things that came to my mind. Yeah, treat children with kindness. It's a bit of a repetition of what you mentioned already. I will not go through these points in detail now, but it's basically all those points that you have mentioned in the chat box. I will move on to the next question. The second question I have is, what should I as a coach do when I get to know about a case of abuse? So somebody mentioned earlier to create an environment where a child can trust me, but what can I do once I get to know about child abuse? Please type your answers or response on the bottom right. What should you as a coach do when somebody reveals to you that they have been abused? Report it. Okay, Frederick says, yeah, I hope then that there are certain measures in place so people can report. Yeah, that it's part of the child protection policy, so people know who to go to, how to report, written and orally. Make the children feel that they have your support. Very, very valuable, very important. Yeah, Omer, in the DRC, it can be you have to report to the police. Yeah, that would now depend again on your local circumstances. Who do you need to report to? But to report it is very important. It can be the police. It can be a child protection, an organization that focuses on child protection and on safeguarding children. Report to the supervisor, as Daniel says, for example, or the relevant authority, and that can depend. It can also be the local chief in certain communities. That could be the person to turn to. That will really depend now on your circumstances and on the country and the community you live in. Investigate, somebody mentions. We will get back to that, Paul. Investigate, we will need to specify a bit who needs to investigate and how do we need to investigate. That will be the next question that I will get to. I look for good methods to stop it, maybe by a discussion with all the group. Okay, when you that's a good point, but I want to make a comment on that. There was Elvis said, I will look for good methods to stop it, maybe by a discussion with all the group. So I think there are two important points to consider. When you talk about methods to stop it, be also very aware of the limitations and the resources that you have. It's always important to give it to the respective authorities to take care of that. So don't try, if you don't have the competence and if it's not the role within your organization, to solve the abuse yourself. You can get into major problems with that. You can harm yourself with that, and you can also, it can in certain cases also be illegal, again depending on where you live. But you can also just do more than your competence allows you to do. And the second part, maybe by a discussion with the group, also be there again careful with the confidentiality of, if a child comes to you and shares her or his experience of abuse, make definitely sure that this abuse and this case doesn't get shared and revealed to everybody. So be very careful that you don't abuse the trust of the child who has revealed that abuse to you. So be very careful with what you discuss with the group and how you discuss it specifically. So definitely not, you can't say, ah, yeah, there has been a case of abuse and now I want to discuss that with you. So be very, very careful with that aspect. But I like in general to discuss with children the abuses they can experience and what they need to do and their behavior they can show, who they can turn to. Yeah, that's definitely very important, but that can happen independently of if somebody reports a case of abuse to you or not. Okay. Yeah, the authorities, to turn to the authorities is very important. Frederick mentions counsel the victims and offer psychosocial support. Yes, if you are a trained counselor, if you have a psychological education, if you have the background, then you can do that. But again, be very careful. If it's not your proficiency, then you need to refer to somebody that can help. So be also very aware of your own and personal limitations and don't try to take too much responsibility on. Good. I will share the thoughts that I had on that matter. I have a bit distinguished between verbal and non-verbal information that you receive, because sometimes it also can happen that the child doesn't turn to you and tells you that it has been abused. It can be that you can see it. Yeah, you can see a bruise, or you can see a wound from a child, or you can see that it behaves differently. It has changed in their character. It has changed in their behavior. Then you can try to look for opportunities to engage the child in a dialogue, to engage with the child in a dialogue. And if they reveal it to you then in a verbal way, then it's very important to remain calm, not to react with shock, horror, or disbelief. I think that's a very important aspect. You should never question the child's statement and ask, oh, does that really happen, or are you sure? No, you really need to react in a way where you trust and show trust towards the child, and where you also reassure the child and say things like, it was good that you told me, it's not your fault. Because if a child experiences abuse, it's been demolished in their confidence. It has been threatened in their self-esteem. So that this reassurance is really important for the child. It's always a big step for anybody to reveal to somebody else that something horrible like abuse happened to him or to her. And then what obviously many of you mentioned, to follow the organizational procedures to report allegations. And they will again be different depending on where you live and where you work. Let me move on to the last question before we come to an end. We'll end in the next about 5 minutes with this webinar. The last question is, what should an organization do if a staff member or volunteer is suspected of child abuse? So that's more now a question of, what do the authorities need to do what does that organization need to do? This is the last round of your feedback, your responses required. So please type your answers in the box on the bottom right. Investigate, report, take prompt action, investigation. Yes. Talk to them. Yeah. Gated. Yeah. The investigation is the responsibility of the organization. It can be the responsibility of the police or other child protection institutions that possibly also might come into your organization and do the investigation. She or he should be suspended and investigated. Yeah. And warn him. Yeah. Talk to them and then take action. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very important also to not forget about the child. Yeah. To reassure the safety of the child and reassure that what they did is right in reporting. Yeah. That part about talk to the suspected staff and see if he or she can change. There it's also an important aspect to consider. It one of the consequences if there's child abuse happening is that this person can be suspended from working with children. That can be one of the consequences that need to be put into place. We need to be aware that child prevention and child protection is a very sensitive issue. So, and it has happened too often around the world and is happening currently, that people who abuse children just continue working with children because nobody puts the finger on it and nobody reports it or nobody takes the proper actions. Yeah, so the aspect about if somebody can change is a very sensitive one, and in most of the cases the consequence would be that the person that has abused can't work with children anymore, because abuse can happen again, and that's a risk that we can't take. Expected volunteer. Yeah. To find out what may have been the reason for the abuse, that might be part of the investigation. I have put now three points together that go into the same direction of what many of you have mentioned. The investigation is an important part, has been mentioned very often, but also that one of the actions that the organization needs to take in regards to the alleged is that he is prevented from having contact with children or youth until the investigation is complete, until it is finally decided and ensured if the child has been abused or not. Until then, the alleged needs to be prevented from having contact with children and youth in general, not just with this child. And the organization must never attempt to conduct their own investigation if they don't have the respective resources. So that it has to be reported to official institutions, to the police or child protection institutions and organizations who do the investigation. And another point can be that refers also to the first point I mentioned, is that the organization should not make any decisions regarding the employment of the alleged until the investigation is complete. So that would be something to basically take this person out of duty, take them out of the contact with children and youth, and put everything regarding their work responsibility on hold until the investigation has been complete. Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and answering these questions. Now I would like to just briefly give you one example what people can do as well, and that's a campaign that I just came across that can help to protect children, or at least raise their awareness. I came across a campaign called The Polished Man, because one of the facts about child abuse is that most of the child abuse happens also through men. And this challenge is that men paint one nail during the month of October, which is still on, to raise awareness on child abuse. And now you could ask, why should somebody paint one nail? The background for that is that there's worldwide, and that's just an estimated number, 1 in 5 children suffer physical and or sexual abuse before the age of 18. So 20% of the children suffer physical and or sexual abuse before the age of 18, not considering the other forms of abuses like emotional or verbal abuse. If you would consider them, I think the number would be easily above 50%. And probably this 20% is still a low estimate, but that's why this campaign that just started in Australia, and if you want more information, please visit the webpage ygap.com.au, where you can find out about this campaign. You can still join in, and I have also joined this campaign by painting one of our nails, which you can see on the next slide, showing and raising awareness, trying to raise awareness to protect children from violations against their rights. And this one nail can probably start already a discussion, because somebody might ask you, because especially for men it's not normal to paint their nails, and you might be asked, why did you paint your nails? And that can be a starting point for a discussion about the importance of child protection and the current situation of child abuse around the world. So at this point, I want to thank you for your participation. This webinar has been recorded, so please feel free to watch it again if you have missed something. And also the presentation that I have used during the webinar will be uploaded just now after I've stopped talking. And then you can also view the PowerPoint presentation that I've used. So there's still 6 days left in October. If you want to join in for this campaign, paint one of your 5 nails. Thank you very much for your participation, and I wish us all good luck in protecting children from violations against their rights, which is an ongoing challenge and an ongoing duty for all of us. Thank you very much. And I will be available for a few more questions if they're still coming in, or if there's still questions that you have, please feel free to ask. I'll be available for a few more minutes. Thank you and goodbye.